In the quiet town of Ashwood, Oregon, Gerald and Evelyn Whitmore were the kind of couple everyone admired, kind, generous, pillars of the community. But one spring morning they vanished. No calls, no shows, no signs of life. What began as a mystery would soon unravel into something far darker. Behind a smiling teenage face, authorities discovered unimaginable horror, a secret so twisted it left even seasoned FBI agents stunned. How could a boy once hailed as a hero become a monster hiding in plain sight? Stay with us, because this isn't just a story, it's a chilling warning. In the small, tree-lined town of Ashwood, Oregon, nestled between rolling hills and sleepy neighborhoods, lived a couple who seemed to define grace, compassion, and quiet strength. Gerald Whitmore, known as Chip to nearly everyone who knew him, was a man of profound dignity. Born in 1925 in rural Nebraska, he had served proudly in the United States Navy during World War II before building a lifelong career as a civil rights attorney. But Chip was never just a lawyer. He was a lover of language, music, and human connection. Friends described him as the kind of man who could quote poetry from memory, debate politics without condescension, and still pick up his guitar and bring a room to life with a blues riff. He had been playing guitar since his 30s, and had remained the frontman of a local blues band for over 5 decades. His wife, Evelyn Whitmore, was no less extraordinary. Born in 1936, she was known for her warm smile, unshakable empathy, and spiritual curiosity. Evelyn had spent much of her life exploring different faiths, Methodism, Buddhism, even Quakerism, before finally finding a spiritual home in the Unitarian Universalist Church of Ashwood. "When I walked through those doors," she once told her daughter, "I knew where my soul had belonged all along." It was there, amidst shared values and open hearts, that she met Chip. Their connection was immediate, effortless, as if fate had been waiting patiently for them to find each other. They married in 1996. Both had been married before, and both brought children and memories from their earlier lives. But when Chip and Evelyn joined hands, their families did too. Between them, they had 9 children, 14 grandchildren, and 8 great-grandchildren. The Whitmore household was often filled with music, laughter, and the smell of home-cooked meals. They celebrated birthdays with backyard barbecues, holidays with candlelit songs, and Sunday mornings with open discussions about philosophy and faith. Neighbors often said theirs was the kind of love that made others believe in second chances. Beyond their family, Chip and Evelyn were pillars of the Ashwood community. Chip served on the city's legal aid board well into his 80s, advocating for veterans and underrepresented families. Evelyn led grief support circles at the church and starred in local theater productions, always choosing roles that reflected her fierce compassion. She was often the first to bring a casserole to a grieving neighbor, and the last to leave when someone needed company in the hospital. Their home on Cowell Ridge Lane was modest but full of character, bright-colored quilts, books stacked in every corner, and photos of smiling grandchildren lining the walls. On Saturday mornings, Chip could often be heard strumming his guitar by the window, while Evelyn tended to her rose garden out back. On Sunday evenings, they would host community dinners with open invitations. "No one leaves hungry or lonely," Evelyn liked to say, and no one ever did. For all their accomplishments, it was never accolades or recognition they sought, it was meaning, connection, peace. The kind of peace that can only come from knowing who you are and giving that self freely to others. Chip's daughter, Lillian, once described them as 2 souls who made the world softer, kinder, and more bearable. Their lives, by all accounts, were full of purpose, full of love. And in 2013, after 17 years of marriage, Chip and Evelyn were exactly where they wanted to be, surrounded by family, active in their passions, and deeply embedded in a community that adored them. To friends, they were role models. To neighbors, they were the heartbeat of Ashwood. To their grandchildren, they were storytellers, musicians, counselors, and guiding lights. There was nothing flashy about the Whitmores, only the quiet brilliance of lives well lived. But peace has a cruel way of hiding what comes next. Because even in the most serene corners of the world, darkness can find a way in. And sometimes that darkness is already living just down the street, waiting, watching, and planning. Nathaniel Kane was once considered a miracle child in the quiet town of Ashwood, Oregon. At just 11 years old, he was hailed as a hero after saving his father's life during a sudden cardiac arrest. The local news stations showed him calmly performing CPR, his small hands pounding rhythmically on his father's chest until paramedics arrived. The boy's composure under pressure earned him a statewide Red Cross Heroes Award. Teachers praised him. Neighbors beamed with pride. He was the golden child, a role model, a son any parent would be proud of. But beneath the spotlight and the applause, something far more sinister had already begun to fester. Nathaniel's life, carefully polished for the public, was rapidly falling apart behind closed doors. That same year, his parents' marriage collapsed in spectacular fashion. His mother, Diane, had been having an affair with Nathaniel's former kindergarten teacher. The betrayal wasn't just scandalous. It was personal. Nathaniel had once trusted this woman. Now he saw her as the destroyer of his family. At just 10 years old, Nathaniel began having thoughts no child should harbor. He started fantasizing about killing his mother's lover. The images were specific, vivid, violent. Strangulation, slashing her throat. He didn't just want her to disappear, he wanted to feel it happen. His mother, perhaps too wrapped in her own drama, seemed oblivious. But Nathaniel's rage was not quiet. It was boiling, and soon it began to spill over. By 11, he confided these thoughts to his therapist. But what should have been a turning point only marked the beginning of a deeper descent. Instead of dismissing his thoughts as passing anger, Nathaniel leaned into them. He became obsessed. Torture, pain, control. These weren't just fantasies anymore, they were cravings. A clinical psychologist diagnosed him with adjustment disorder with depressed mood. To combat his anxiety and dark ideation, he was placed on Prozac. But Nathaniel wasn't just dealing with sadness. He was unraveling, and no pill could rewire what had already started breaking inside his mind. Over the next 2 years, Nathaniel bounced between his father's modest home in central Ashwood and his mother's newer condo on the west side. But the back and forth only deepened his instability. His father eventually kicked him out at 14, fed up with Nathaniel's chain smoking, his drinking, his outbursts. Nathaniel moved in permanently with his mother, but there was little sense of stability or warmth. Just two people, coexisting in silence, mistrust, and mutual resentment. By 2011, Nathaniel developed anorexia. His body was wasting away, matching the psychological hollowing within. He was admitted into an intensive outpatient program and placed under constant observation. After his release, his cocktail of medications grew. Celexa, then Lexapro, and eventually back to Prozac. Antipsychotics were added to the mix. But the symptoms didn't recede. In fact, they evolved. Nathaniel began experiencing derealization, feeling as if the world around him wasn't real. He described out-of-body experiences where he would look down on himself, watching as if he were a character in someone else's story. The walls between fantasy and reality blurred. And the people around him? They were no longer humans in his eyes. They were potential. He started seeing people as targets. Not friends, not classmates, but ideas, scenarios to explore, manipulate, destroy. He fixated on how he might kill them, not with fear or hesitation, but with curiosity, precision, interest. These weren't passing thoughts anymore. They were routines, a lens through which he viewed the world. Then came the fires. Small at first, trash bins, abandoned sheds. But the thrill of watching something burn was intoxicating to him. It made him feel powerful. Then animals began to suffer. A friend once watched Nathaniel calmly strangle a neighborhood cat in the middle of the street. When questioned, Nathaniel simply shrugged and said, "I hated that cat." Then, in an almost chillingly casual tone, he asked, "Can I kill your dog next?" No one knew how to respond. He wasn't joking. There was no smirk. Just an eerie calm. His darkness wasn't hidden anymore. It was daring people to notice. And most didn't. Still, there were whispers. Nathaniel confided in more peers. He talked about wanting to kill classmates. He even discussed the logistics of a school massacre. His school counselor, alarmed, reported it. Police were called. But each time, the system defaulted to the same assessment. No credible threat. Each time, Nathaniel returned to school. Back to the hallways. Back to his fantasies. He continued seeing therapists and school psychologists, revealing more each time. Once, he explained in detail how he fantasized about peeling skin from a person's body, cutting off their eyelids. When asked if he truly intended to act on these thoughts, he looked his counselor dead in the eye and said, "I have full confidence that I could hurt these people." Still, somehow, he was allowed to walk free. His journal entries became increasingly graphic. Drawings of mutilated bodies. Diagrams of homes in his neighborhood with notes like "window unlatched" or "no dog." He wasn't just fantasizing. He was preparing. One teacher would later recall an art project where students were asked to paint a peaceful place. Nathaniel's canvas? A blood-red forest with eyes peering out from the trees. When asked about it, he simply said, "It's peaceful to me." By the time Nathaniel turned 15, he wasn't trying to hide. In fact, he was daring the world to look closer. He told friends that if he ever killed someone, he'd just claim insanity. He even practiced what he'd say, how he'd cry, how he'd act scared. And if that didn't work, he'd simply kill himself before anyone could catch him. But he didn't. Because deep down, Nathaniel Kane didn't want to escape justice. He wanted to be remembered. From the outside, Nathaniel Kane was just another troubled teen. Quiet, withdrawn, smart but distant. But beneath that unremarkable exterior was a raging storm that no one seemed willing or ready to confront. The first signs came early. At just 10 years old, Nathaniel confessed to a school counselor that he wanted to strangle his mother's former lover, his kindergarten teacher, with his bare hands. When pressed, he said it wasn't just anger. It was fascination, a pull, a dark curiosity. And that wasn't all. He described detailed fantasies about torture, about peeling back someone's skin slowly, about watching them squirm. These weren't childish tantrums or fleeting thoughts. These were cold, methodical visualizations, the kind of things that should have set off every alarm. But instead, they were filed away in manila folders and discussed in hushed voices during brief counseling sessions. Doctors labeled him with adjustment disorder with depressed mood, a phrase that sounds clinical, harmless even. He was prescribed Prozac, then Celexa, then Lexapro, then back to Prozac again. Each time a new bottle, a new diagnosis, a new hope that maybe this would be the chemical fix. But nothing ever changed. The thoughts didn't go away. They just got clearer. By 7th grade, Nathaniel was deep into therapy. Social workers came and went. Files grew thicker. Still, no one saw the iceberg below the surface. At age 14, when his father finally kicked him out for constant drinking and smoking, Nathaniel moved in with his mother full-time. That same year, he developed severe anorexia. The doctors said he was wasting away, physically and emotionally. He was admitted to an intensive outpatient program, monitored daily. But the thoughts, the fantasies, they only grew louder. Nathaniel began to dissociate. He spoke of frequent out-of-body experiences. He would stare into the mirror and not recognize the face looking back. He wrote in his journal about becoming numb, about watching people and picturing them not as classmates or teachers, but as objects, targets, opportunities. He started spending hours on gore websites, fixated on videos showing brutal violence. He shared links with friends. He laughed at what he saw. He wasn't hiding it anymore. When he looked at animals, stray cats, neighborhood dogs, he didn't feel affection. He felt hate. One night, in front of 2 friends, Nathaniel strangled a cat on the sidewalk. When one of them asked why, he simply shrugged and said, "I wanted to. I hated that cat." Then he asked, with a terrifying calmness, "Can I kill your dog next?" His friends were horrified, but they didn't report him. A few days later, Nathaniel confided in another classmate. He said he had been dreaming about a school shooting, about locking the doors and picking people off one by one. When asked if he would actually go through with it, Nathaniel looked them in the eyes and said, "I'm confident I could hurt people. No question." This time, someone finally told an adult. The police were called to the school. A resource officer sat down with Nathaniel, asked him direct questions. The school counselor provided her notes. A pattern was clear: disturbing thoughts, violent fantasies, a long history of obsession with pain and death. And still nothing happened. Authorities determined that Nathaniel wasn't a danger to himself or others. No charges. No arrest. Not even a psychiatric hold. He was allowed to walk out of the office and return to class. Weeks passed. More sessions with counselors. More revelations. Nathaniel admitted that he didn't just think about violence, he planned it. He described slicing off eyelids, sawing through bone, dismembering a human body. He said he had stopped fighting the urges. That resistance was pointless. Yet again, none of this was reported to law enforcement. Why? Because Nathaniel hadn't named a specific victim. No imminent threat, no intervention. The system chose paperwork over protection. And the clock kept ticking. Nathaniel wasn't even trying to hide anymore. He began telling people openly, almost proudly. He'd whisper in hallways, chuckle during lunch, mention what he'd do if he ever snapped. His friends were terrified, but paralyzed by uncertainty. Was it all talk? Was he just being edgy? One girl wrote in her diary that being around Nathaniel made her feel like a mouse staring at a snake. Another said she stopped walking home alone because he knew where I lived. And he watched me. But still, no one picked up the phone. The red flags weren't subtle. They were firetruck red, flapping in the wind. Nathaniel's notebook doodles were filled with knives, blood, mutilated faces. His search history was a horror show. His therapy notes read like warnings, page after page of escalating depravity. But every adult who crossed his path seemed to hope someone else would deal with it. Teachers chalked it up to creative expression. Counselors thought he was working through trauma. Parents, already exhausted by custody battles, assumed the other side was handling it. No one asked the hardest question. What if Nathaniel Kane wasn't imagining what he might do, but preparing for it? By spring, the whispers had grown louder, but the system remained silent. And somewhere inside that silence, Nathaniel's fantasies sharpened into intention. He didn't need a plan anymore. He was the plan. And by the time anyone realized just how dangerous he truly was, 2 people would already be dead. It began like any other quiet spring night in Ashwood. The air was cool, the streets still. Most of the town was asleep, trusting, safe, unprepared. But for one teenager, this night had been brewing for years. At just past 2 a.m., Nathaniel Kane crept out of his mother's house, careful not to make a sound. In his backpack, he carried a 6-inch serrated hunting knife, black gloves, and a ski cap. He had wrapped duct tape around the soles of his shoes, his own invention, designed to prevent footprints. This wasn't a sudden outburst. It was a mission. He walked the empty sidewalks like a shadow, scanning for opportunity. But he wasn't looking for valuables. He was hunting people, vulnerable people. He would later say he didn't care who they were. He just wanted someone, anyone, to kill. Then, just 2 blocks from his father's house, he found what he was looking for. The modest condo at 412 Cowell Ridge belonged to Gerald Chip Whitmore and his wife, Evelyn. It was dark inside. Still. Peaceful. Through the backyard, Nathaniel approached the window. He took out a pocket knife and silently slashed through the screen. The lock was loose. The window gave. He slipped inside without a sound. He sat in their living room for several minutes, listening, breathing, adjusting to the space. The only sound was the soft ticking of a clock and the low rumble of snoring coming from the bedroom down the hall. Nathaniel later said this moment, this quiet before the storm, made him feel completely alive. He walked the hallway slowly, knife in hand. With each step, the fantasy that had haunted his mind for years took on a new shape. This was no longer a thought. It was real. It was happening. He entered the master bedroom. Evelyn was the first to stir. Maybe it was a creak in the floor or the shift of air in the room. Her eyes opened, and she saw him. A boy. A stranger. Standing over her bed with a blade. She screamed. And then the horror began. Nathaniel plunged the knife into her torso, again and again. Evelyn tried to push him away, crying out for help, begging for her life. Her voice woke Chip, who barely had time to register what was happening before the blade turned on him. Nathaniel stabbed him in the neck, the chest, the stomach, relentlessly, methodically, viciously. He didn't stop when they stopped moving. He kept going. 60+ stab wounds per victim. Multiple organs pierced. Arteries severed. It wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was enjoyment. Nathaniel would later describe it as a high. A rush of dopamine. A moment of clarity and power unlike anything he'd ever felt before. And then the mutilation. Inside Evelyn's abdomen, police would later find a cell phone, placed there intentionally, with precision. Inside Chip's chest cavity was a drinking glass. Nathaniel admitted he had inserted the items simply to see what it would feel like. He was experimenting, testing boundaries. There was no purpose beyond curiosity. He cleaned the knife in the sink, wiped down surfaces. He took off his gloves, his ski cap, his blood-stained jacket, and placed them neatly in his backpack. Then he crawled back out the window, stepped into the cool night, and vanished into the silence. By the time the sun came up over Ashwood, the killer was already home. Showered, calm, preparing for school. Back inside the Whitmore residence, everything was still. Too still. Chip's guitar sat untouched by the door. Evelyn's favorite scarf was draped over a chair. The kind of details that only mattered because they would never be moved again. The bodies weren't discovered for another 18 hours. When Chip failed to show up for his regular band rehearsal, a tradition spanning nearly 5 decades, his bandmates were confused. He had never missed a session. Ever. Not once. But maybe he had gone out of town. Maybe Evelyn had fallen ill. No one panicked. Not yet. It wasn't until the next morning, when neither of them appeared at church, a place they never skipped, that someone finally called the police. Evelyn's daughter Laura arrived at the condo at the same time as officers. They rang the bell. No answer. The front door was locked. Laura walked around back and noticed the window screen had been slashed. She called out again. Still nothing. A flashlight through the window revealed something chilling. Blood. On the walls. On the bed. On the floor. The officers forced entry. Inside the bedroom, the scene was nightmarish. Blood pooled across the sheets. Spattered across the walls. Chip and Evelyn were lying side by side, brutally mutilated. Multiple stab wounds. Defensive injuries on their hands. The room reeked of metal and fear. Detectives arrived within minutes. Crime scene tape went up. Photographers snapped hundreds of images. But something was off. There were no fingerprints. No forced entry. No signs of robbery or struggle beyond the murders themselves. It looked like the killer had known exactly what they were doing. But who would do this? And why? Gerald and Evelyn were beloved. Retired. Kind. Their neighbors adored them. They had no enemies. No debts. No dark secrets. The randomness of it made it even worse. The idea that someone could slip in and butcher them so violently, and leave without a trace. The lead detective would later call it the most disturbing scene of his entire career. Back at school, Nathaniel Kane sat in the cafeteria, scrolling through his phone. He smiled as classmates whispered about the murders. No one knew it yet, but the boy eating a sandwich just feet away from them was the monster who had turned fantasy into flesh and blood. And he was only getting started. The morning after the discovery, Ashwood awoke to sirens and flashing lights. Police cruisers lined up outside a modest condo, yellow tape slicing through the quiet suburban calm. Word spread fast. The Whitmores were dead. Not just dead, murdered. Brutally. Violently. Shock morphed into fear. This wasn't some burglary gone wrong. There was no sign of theft. No broken locks. No kicked-in doors. Just two beloved elders, butchered in their own home, left behind like discarded objects. No one in Ashwood could make sense of it. By noon, the community was in collective panic. If Gerald and Evelyn, pillars of the town, could be targeted, who was safe? Rumors swirled through church halls, cafes, grocery stores. Was this random? Or worse, was someone among them responsible? Detectives had no solid leads. No DNA. No fingerprints. No forced entry. The killer had entered like smoke and disappeared like a ghost. All that remained was carnage and questions. When there are no obvious suspects, investigators often start close to home. And that's exactly what they did. The Whitmore's grandson, Oliver, quickly found himself at the center of attention. Oliver was 24. Quiet. Largely kept to himself. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia several years earlier. He was on medication sometimes. Other times not. He lived just a few miles from his grandparents. He had keys to their home. He also had a complicated past, multiple hospitalizations, occasional outbursts, and a strained relationship with parts of the family. It didn't help that he wasn't answering his phone when the news broke. Police zeroed in. They brought in Oliver's father, Robert, the son of Gerald Whitmore, for questioning. Then they brought in Oliver himself. Over the next 48 hours, the family endured over 12 hours of interrogation. No lawyers. No breaks. Just endless rounds of the same grim questions. Where were you that night? Do you own a knife? Why were the carpets in your house steam cleaned the morning after the murders? Robert explained calmly, though exhausted, that he had rented a steamer days prior for spring cleaning. A coincidence, yes, but hardly a crime. Still, investigators weren't convinced. Then came the artwork. While searching Robert's home, detectives found a disturbing drawing by his youngest son, Tony, age 11. The image showed a man holding a knife, standing over two figures in a bed. One male, one female, both bleeding. To police, it looked like a child's interpretation of a double murder. To the Whitmore family, it was devastating. Tony loved his grandparents. He adored them. So did Oliver. In fact, just a week earlier, Oliver had posted a photo of himself with Evelyn, captioned, "The warmest heart I've ever known." Could someone who wrote that truly commit such horror? The family said no. But suspicion lingered. Not just from police, but from neighbors, friends, even church members. People looked at Oliver differently now. Some crossed the street when they saw him. Others stopped returning calls. The emotional toll was staggering. Robert said he knew his father would have wanted them to cooperate fully. So they did, answering every question, opening their homes, volunteering DNA. But no amount of transparency could erase the shadow of doubt. Tony, despite being just a boy, began having nightmares. He told his therapist he felt like everyone thought he was a killer. He stopped going to school. He started sleeping with the lights on. Eventually, police cleared the family of any involvement. There was no evidence, physical or circumstantial, that pointed to them. But the damage had already been done. The Whitmore family had lost their parents. And then while grieving, they were treated like criminals. Robert described the experience as being dismantled from the inside. Trust, he said, was the first thing to vanish. One day you're the grieving son, the next you're the suspect in a double homicide. It's a trauma that doesn't go away. And for Tony it never did. 3 years later, Tony took his own life. He was 14. In his final note he wrote, "I didn't kill anyone. I just miss them. And I'm tired of people looking at me like I'm something I'm not." The family never recovered from that second loss. Gerald and Evelyn were taken violently. Tony, slowly, silently. All while the real killer walked free. At this point, investigators were back at square one. No forensic leads. No credible suspects. No apparent motive. The murders were so violent, so personal, it was hard to imagine a stranger committing them. Yet none of the couple's loved ones had anything to gain, and all had airtight alibis. Then came a whisper. Not from a detective. Not from a witness. But from a teenager, one of Nathaniel Kane's classmates. He had heard something. A story. A confession. A joke, maybe? He wasn't sure. But the details were chillingly specific. And it wasn't long before other students started to come forward, each carrying their own fragment of a horrifying puzzle. One that, when assembled, pointed to someone no one had considered. A boy. A quiet one. Bright. Polite. Just another kid. But beneath the hoodie, behind the eyes, a killer. While the Whitmore family mourned, and police chased dead ends, the real killer was talking. Nathaniel Kane had never been good at keeping secrets. But what came next wasn't a slip. It wasn't a confession born of guilt. It was something far more chilling, a performance. The very day the bodies of Gerald and Evelyn Whitmore were discovered, Nathaniel leaned over to a friend in class and whispered, "You heard what happened on Cowell Ridge?" His friend shook his head. Nathaniel smirked. "I did it." At first, the boy thought it was a joke. A sick joke, maybe, but nothing more. Nathaniel had always said weird things. He was that kid. The one who talked about serial killers, violence, death. But this felt different. The next day, he told someone else. A girl he'd been dating off and on for a few months. They were sitting under the bleachers during lunch when he asked, "You ever kill someone in your dreams?" She laughed nervously. Nathaniel didn't. He stared straight ahead and said, "I've done it in real life. Last weekend. 2 of them." She went still. He turned toward her, eyes gleaming, and whispered every detail. How he picked the house, how he crawled through the window, how Evelyn had screamed, how Chip had fought back. He even told her about placing the phone and the glass inside the bodies. He called it an experiment. He called it amazing. He said, "You don't know what living feels like until you've watched it drain out of someone else." She wanted to believe he was lying. She needed to. But there was something about the way he said it. So calm. So proud. So intimate. Nathaniel didn't stop there. Over the next 2 weeks, he told at least 4 more people, classmates, friends, even a cousin. He seemed almost desperate to share, like the murder was too exhilarating to keep to himself. To one friend, he said, "I did something huge, and they don't even know it was me." Then he pulled out a small box from his locker and opened it. Inside was a blood-stained glove, a folding knife, a crumpled ski cap, and a photo, taken with a flip phone, of the bloody soles of his taped-over shoes. He grinned. "My little trophy case," he said. Still, no one said anything. Not yet. Some didn't believe him. Others were terrified. One friend said later, "I thought if I told, I'd be next." But Nathaniel wasn't done. At school, his demeanor changed. He was suddenly upbeat, participating more in class, laughing. One teacher even nominated him for Student of the Month. That same week, he was featured in a school newsletter for helping organize a book drive, all while keeping a murder weapon in his backpack. But the mask didn't stay on for long. A few days later, a classmate reported seeing Nathaniel with a knife tucked into his hoodie pocket. School administrators confronted him. He was suspended, told not to return until further notice. That was when his girlfriend broke up with him. She didn't say why, but deep down she knew. Nathaniel didn't take it well. One night, she came home late from a friend's house. Her bedroom light was off, but something felt off. When she flipped on the lamp, she screamed. Nathaniel was sitting on her bedroom floor. He'd snuck in through the garage. He stood up slowly and said, "I missed you." She ran, locked herself in the bathroom, called her brother. When he arrived, Nathaniel was gone. But the message was clear, he wasn't letting go. The girl told one of Nathaniel's friends about the break-in. That friend finally cracked. He called Nathaniel's father, Bill Kane. He told him everything. The bragging, the knife, the clothes, the whispered confession. But Bill refused to believe it. "My son saved my life once," he said. "He's not capable of this." So the kids went to the police themselves. Two teenagers, scared, trembling, sitting across from seasoned detectives, recounting stories they barely believed themselves. And those stories matched, down to the smallest details. The window, the snoring, the number of stabs, the cell phone inside Evelyn's body. Things that hadn't been made public. Things only the killer would know. That was enough. The very next morning, officers walked into Ashwood High School and quietly escorted Nathaniel Kane out of class. Students watched from the hallway stunned. Some thought it was a prank. Others thought he was being arrested for carrying the knife. No one imagined they were watching the capture of a confessed double murderer. At the station, Nathaniel was calm. Too calm. He denied everything. Said his friends were lying. Said it was just dark humor. But then detectives played an audio recording. One of the kids had recorded a conversation. Nathaniel's voice, describing the murders, laughing. He went quiet. Then he said, "Fine. I did it. And I'd do it again." The moment Nathaniel Kane sat down in the interrogation room, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The room wasn't particularly intimidating, just beige walls, a metal table, 2 chairs, a ticking clock. But what unfolded inside it would shatter whatever illusion remained that Nathaniel was just a troubled teenager. Across from him sat Detective Maria Pineda and FBI Special Agent Christopher Campion. Both had seen their fair share of suspects, liars, manipulators, even killers. But nothing quite like Nathaniel. At first, he denied everything. Calmly, confidently. He claimed his classmates were making it up, that he was being framed, that it was a joke gone too far. "I'm a kid," he said, arms crossed, voice steady. "You think I killed 2 people? That's ridiculous." He even chuckled. A light, disarming laugh. But the agents weren't laughing. They pushed gently, then harder, asking about the night of the murders. Where he was, what he was doing, why his name kept coming up in whispers and anonymous tips. Nathaniel held his ground for a while. Then Agent Campion pulled out a recording. A voice played through the speaker. His voice, describing the murder of Gerald and Evelyn Whitmore in graphic detail. Bragging, relishing. The change was instant. Nathaniel's shoulders sank. His smirk disappeared. His breathing changed. Then came the words. "Okay, yeah, I did it." And then the floodgates opened. For the next 3.5 hours, Nathaniel Kane told investigators everything. Not with shame, not with remorse, but with clinical clarity. He began by explaining that he had made the decision to kill someone weeks before the attack. He didn't have a specific target. He was just ready. That night, he said, he left his mother's house between 2 and 3 a.m., dressed in black, knife in hand, shoes taped. He wandered the streets of Ashwood for over an hour, looking for a house that felt right. When he spotted the Whitmore's condo, he said it called to him. He detailed slashing the window screen, crawling inside, waiting, listening to them snore. He told the agents how Evelyn woke up and screamed, and how that scream triggered something in him. He stabbed her repeatedly, then turned on Gerald as he tried to get up from bed. The words he used were chilling. "It felt clean," he said, like everything made sense in that moment. He said he kept stabbing even after they stopped moving because I wanted to see what a body would do, how far it would go. When Detective Pineda asked why he placed a cell phone inside Evelyn and a glass inside Gerald, Nathaniel paused, then said, "Because I could. I wanted to leave something behind, like a mark." He admitted he had fantasized about killing for years, that he had visualized every detail hundreds of times. That night was just the execution of a long-held dream. Agent Campion leaned forward. "Do you feel any remorse, Nathaniel?" A long pause. Then a shrug. "I feel satisfied, like I finally did what I was supposed to do." He said the act gave him a rush of dopamine, adrenaline, like a drug. He had never felt so alive. Then came the most disturbing part. Campion asked, "Do you think about killing other people too?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "Every day," he said. "Whenever I look at someone, I imagine how I'd do it. Strangle them, drown them, stab them. It flashes in my head like a slideshow. I don't even have to try. It just happens." Campion went further. "So how would you kill me?" Nathaniel leaned back, thought for a second, then said, "I'd choke you with your tie. Or maybe smash your face into that mirror behind you. Use the glass to cut your neck. Gouge your eyes. Doesn't matter really. Lots of ways." Then he added, "It's nothing personal." For Pineda and Campion, the interview was unlike anything they had encountered. Here was a 16-year-old boy describing murder not as a mistake, not as a moment of rage, but as a thrill, a need, a lifestyle. When asked about the items he used, Nathaniel provided their exact location, a box hidden behind old sports gear in his mother's garage. When investigators went to retrieve it, everything was exactly as he'd described: bloodied clothes, the knife, the gloves, the tape, all untouched since the night of the killings. The evidence was irrefutable. But there was still one question left hanging in the air. Why Gerald and Evelyn? Nathaniel's answer was as cruel as it was simple. Because they were there. That's it. I didn't know them. But they looked old, vulnerable, easy. He had no connection to the Whitmores. No vendetta. No motive beyond curiosity and impulse. Detectives left the room shaken. Nathaniel Kane wasn't just a killer. He was a ticking bomb that had finally gone off. And no one, not the therapists, not the teachers, not the family, had been able to stop him. The confession sealed his fate. But the question that lingered for everyone involved was darker still. How many more would there have been, if Nathaniel hadn't told? The news broke like a thunderclap across Ashwood. Nathaniel Kane, age 16, would be tried as an adult for the brutal murders of Gerald and Evelyn Whitmore. It stunned the town. For many, Nathaniel had been that strange but quiet kid, the one who doodled knives in his notebooks, the one who sat alone during lunch. But a double murderer? A psychopath? A teenager standing trial with adults, facing life behind bars? It didn't seem real. But nothing about this case had ever felt real. The charges were severe. 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, multiple victims, lying in wait, torture, use of a deadly weapon. The district attorney's office made one thing painfully clear: they would seek the maximum penalty possible. In a press conference outside the courthouse, Assistant District Attorney Michael Cabral stood before a sea of microphones and said, "In nearly 3 decades, I have never seen a more depraved act, nor a defendant with a more disturbing level of detachment. We are not prosecuting a child. We are prosecuting a calculated killer." The courtroom was packed on day one. News outlets lined the sidewalks. Protesters with signs argued on both sides of the courthouse steps, some demanding justice for the Whitmores, others questioning whether a boy that young should face adult punishment. Inside, Nathaniel entered through a secured side entrance, his face partially covered, wearing a button-up shirt and tie, no handcuffs, no prison uniform. His defense team had petitioned for civilian attire, fearing that seeing him in jail clothes would bias potential jurors. But no wardrobe could erase the truth. Nathaniel looked calm. Too calm. His eyes scanned the room. His father sat on one bench, alone, head low. Across the aisle, the Whitmore family, daughters, sons, grandchildren, sat clenching tissues, silent, stone-faced. Opening arguments began with the prosecution laying out the sheer brutality of the murders. 60-plus stab wounds each, post-mortem mutilation, the bizarre trophies placed inside the bodies. They described how Nathaniel had stalked the home, waited in silence, and attacked 2 people who had never harmed him, never spoken to him. But more disturbing than the crime itself, they said, was what came after, how Nathaniel bragged, laughed, reenacted, and showed zero remorse. This wasn't the work of a child acting out of rage, ADA Cabral told the jury. This was a fantasy, carefully rehearsed and gleefully executed. Then the defense rose. They didn't deny Nathaniel's guilt. That was impossible. The confession, the evidence, it was all there. Instead, they painted a picture of a deeply disturbed boy failed by every institution meant to protect him. They spoke of years of untreated mental illness, conflicting medications, neglect, and trauma. They said Nathaniel had experienced derealization, hallucinations, and suicidal ideation since he was 10. That he had begged for help and been ignored. This is not justice, his lead attorney argued. This is retribution against a broken mind. They pleaded with the jury to consider one thing: insanity. And to bolster their case, they brought in experts. Dr. Matthew Sullier, a psychiatrist with decades of experience in juvenile psychopathy, testified that Nathaniel had shown classic symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, combined with disassociation and severe emotional blunting. He described Nathaniel's mental state as fractured, detached, and potentially psychotic at the time of the murders. But under cross-examination, Sullier admitted Nathaniel still knew what he was doing, and that it was wrong. That was the crack prosecutors needed. They pushed hard, bringing in another expert, Dr. Logan, a forensic psychologist who administered the psychopathy checklist, PCLR, the gold standard. Nathaniel scored a 35.8 out of 40. One of the highest scores Dr. Logan had ever recorded. "This is not a temporary break from reality," he said. "This is a pattern. This is manipulation, violence, and lack of empathy embedded deep into the personality." He may have been 15 when he killed, but he knew exactly what he was doing. Witnesses followed. Friends, former classmates, his ex-girlfriend, all recounted the confessions, the bragging, the glint in his eyes when he described what he'd done. One boy cried on the stand as he said, he looked happy about it, like he'd done something great. Then, the Whitmore family took the stand. Mary, the daughter of Gerald Whitmore, spoke softly but firmly. She described her father as a man who always fought for justice, even for the underdog. She said she didn't believe in the death penalty, but that she also didn't believe in second chances for people who mutilated the innocent. "My father believed in redemption," she said, "but he also believed that some things are too dangerous to be forgiven." On September 26th, after 5 weeks of testimony, hundreds of exhibits, and dozens of witnesses, the jury left the courtroom to deliberate. It took them less than 2 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts. The courtroom was silent as the words were read aloud. Then came the second phase, sanity. Was Nathaniel legally sane at the time of the killings? For days later, the jury answered. Yes. He was sane. He was aware. He was responsible. Judge Raymond Reed looked directly at Nathaniel as he delivered the sentence. 2 consecutive terms of 25 years to life, plus 2 years for the use of a deadly weapon. Nathaniel would be eligible for parole after 52 years. He would be in his late 60s. The judge paused, then added, "You didn't kill because you snapped. You killed because you wanted to. And you kept wanting to. That's why you're here today." The Whitmore family wept. Not in celebration, but in release. The weight, at least for now, had shifted off their shoulders. Outside, the community stood still. The trial was over. But the nightmare was far from finished. Just when the town of Ashwood thought it could breathe again, the legal system reminded everyone that some nightmares don't end with a verdict. In 2016, 2 years after Nathaniel Kane was convicted and sentenced to 52 years to life, California voters passed Proposition 57, a sweeping reform bill focused on juvenile justice. Among other things, it granted juvenile defendants the right to a fitness hearing, forcing prosecutors to prove why a minor should be tried as an adult. At first, the Whitmore family paid it little attention. After all, Nathaniel had already been tried, convicted, and sentenced. Their nightmare was over. Or so they thought. In 2018, just before the law took full effect, another legislative bombshell dropped. Senate Bill 1391. It stated that anyone under the age of 16 at the time of their crime could no longer be tried in adult court, regardless of the crime, no matter how heinous. And Nathaniel Kane had been 15. The law was meant to protect young offenders from being thrown away by the system. Lawmakers argued that adolescent brains weren't fully developed, that juveniles had a greater capacity for change. They pointed to data, case studies, brain scans. But for the Whitmore family, it wasn't science, it was betrayal. If the new law applied retroactively, Nathaniel's conviction could be tossed out. He'd be retried in juvenile court. And if convicted again, he wouldn't serve 52 years. He'd be released at age 25. No parole, no supervision, no record. He would walk free. The community erupted. Over 300 letters were sent to the court opposing any retroactive relief. Families, neighbors, teachers, people who had attended the Whitmore's church, seen them in the supermarket, heard Chip's guitar from the porch on warm evenings. They all feared what would happen if Nathaniel was ever let out. One woman wrote, "If this boy gets out, my family leaves Ashwood. I won't raise my daughter in a town where a killer roams free." In a press conference, Evelyn's eldest daughter, Victoria, stood beside the district attorney and held up a framed photo of her mother. Her voice cracked as she said, "We got justice once. We sat through the trial. We buried our dead. And now we have to fight for it all over again. It's cruel. It's exhausting. And it's wrong. But the law was the law." Nathaniel's defense team filed a petition to overturn the adult sentence and remand the case back to juvenile court. They cited the passage of SB 1391 and emphasized that Nathaniel had shown extraordinary growth while incarcerated. They even submitted a TED-style talk Nathaniel had recorded behind bars, entitled "Embracing Our Humanity." In the video, Nathaniel spoke calmly and eloquently about trauma, forgiveness, and his desire to give back to the community. He claimed to have been abused, to have been broken, but now he was healing. The video was uploaded to YouTube. It sparked immediate outrage. The Whitmore family had no idea the talk was being filmed. No idea it would be posted online for anyone to see. To them, it was salt in a wound that had never truly closed. 2 days later, after an outcry, the video was removed. But by then, it had already been downloaded and re-uploaded across the internet. The damage was done. Victoria told reporters, "We don't get to upload our grief. We don't get to go viral with our pain. But he gets a platform, a second chance. My mom doesn't get to be reformed." Despite emotional appeals from the victim's family and fierce opposition from the district attorney's office, the hearing moved forward. Nathaniel took the stand again. He claimed he didn't remember the killings, claimed he had blocked them out, claimed he was afraid to face what he had done. But forensic records from his incarceration told another story. A prison psychologist testified that Nathaniel had tattooed an image of Evelyn's wounds on his chest, not in remorse, but to keep her with him. When asked why, Nathaniel allegedly replied, "It's my origin story." The judge was visibly disturbed. Still, the court was bound to examine the question. Had the previous judge erred by trying Nathaniel as an adult? The legal arguments were complex, technical, procedural, but the stakes were simple. A double killer could go free. In the end, Judge McAdam made his decision. He ruled in favor of the prosecution. Nathaniel Kane would remain in adult prison. The courtroom didn't erupt. There was no applause. Just quiet tears, exhales of relief, and exhaustion. The Whitmore family didn't celebrate. They went home, knowing they'd won for now, because a new appeal would soon follow. Then another, and so they braced themselves for the next filing, the next hearing, the next fight to keep justice from slipping through the cracks. Because in this new era of reform and redemption, one truth remained. Some scars never heal, and some monsters don't either. On August 18, 2021, 8 years after the murders of Gerald and Evelyn Whitmore, yet another hearing was held in the Court of Appeal. The courtroom felt more like a war zone than a legal chamber. Every word, every motion, every sigh carried the weight of years of trauma, litigation, grief, and exhaustion. This wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about a system deciding whether one of the most calculated teenage killers in state history deserved another chance. Nathaniel Kane's legal team returned once again, this time filing a petition to reconsider his adult conviction under the retroactive application of Senate Bill 1391. They argued that despite Judge McAdam's decision to keep Nathaniel in adult court, the law had since changed, and with that change came a moral obligation to revisit his status. Their central point? Nathaniel was 15 at the time of the murders. And under current law, number 15-year-old could be tried in adult court. So why should he? The answer, according to the prosecution, was simple. Because he wasn't like other 15-year-olds. Because he had proven, time and again, that rehabilitation was not a realistic expectation. That he had not only committed a horrific act, but taken pride in it, boasted about it, branded it into his skin, and kept on fighting not for forgiveness, but for freedom. This hearing was different. There was no new evidence, no witnesses, no jury, just legal briefs, technicalities, statutes debated across microphones. But in the gallery, sitting with hands clenched in their laps, were the same familiar faces, the Whitmore family. Still showing up, still fighting, still refusing to let the legacy of two loving people be reduced to footnotes in a criminal reform debate. Victoria Whitmore, Evelyn's daughter, had prepared another statement, read into the record by the family's legal representative. "This is not about vengeance," it said. "This is about safety, about justice, about not having to check the release calendar of your parent's killer every year. We are not here to punish a child. We are here to contain a predator. A week later, the appellate court delivered its ruling. The petition was denied. Nathaniel Kane would not be resentenced. He would not be retried. His adult conviction in 52 to life sentence would stand. The court found that Judge McAdam had not abused his discretion, and that SB 1391 could not be applied retroactively in this case, as the legal process had already reached its final stage prior to its enactment. The news rippled through Ashwood with a strange mix of emotions. There was relief, of course, but also a profound weariness, because this had not been justice served in one fell swoop. It had been justice wrestled over and over through bureaucracy, exhaustion, and endless re-traumatization. The Whitmore's granddaughter Elizabeth posted a message online. "We've won. For now. But we know better than to let our guard down. The next law, the next appeal, it's always around the corner." And she was right. Just months later, Nathaniel's attorneys filed another motion, this time with the California Supreme Court, arguing for the application of Proposition 57 and asking for a new fitness hearing. The court declined to hear the case. But even that didn't stop them. In early 2022, a new request emerged. Nathaniel Kane, now approaching his 25th birthday, sought early release under the auspices of juvenile parole reform laws. This was the nightmare scenario. If successful, it meant that the man who had stabbed two strangers over 100 times, mutilated their bodies, and bragged about it, would be released within months. No parole board. No public notice. No record. Just gone. Free. The state responded with force. The DA's office filed an emergency injunction. Multiple advocacy groups for victims' rights joined in. Even retired law enforcement officers who had worked the case submitted letters begging the court to intervene. But none were louder than the Whitmore family. They returned to the courtroom once again, standing before the same system that had put them through a decade of grief, and said, "Enough." They showed the court photos of Evelyn's injuries. They read from Nathaniel's confession. They reminded the world that this wasn't theoretical, that real people had died, that the person asking for mercy had once described their deaths as the happiest moment of my life. And finally, on September 30th, 2022, the final decision came down. Nathaniel Kane would not be released. The court found that, regardless of age at the time of the crime, the details of the offense and the ongoing threat posed to public safety outweighed all factors of rehabilitation. In their final remarks, the panel wrote, "There exists a line, a moral and legal line, between juvenile crime and irredeemable violence. The petitioner crossed that line with intention, with awareness, and with pride. And some lines, once crossed, cannot be erased." The Whitmore family cried. Not with joy, with relief. For now the door was closed. For now they could sleep. But even that came with caution. Because Nathaniel Kane, though sentenced to 52 years, would remain eligible for parole after 25. And when that time comes, when another hearing is scheduled, when another courtroom is filled, they will be there again. Ready, tired, but unrelenting. Because they understand what the system sometimes forgets. Justice isn't a moment. It's a fight. And for some families, it never ends. For the town of Ashwood, the name Nathaniel Kane will never be just a name. It will always be a shadow, a whisper in the school hallways, a pause in late-night conversations, a reminder that the most monstrous acts don't always come from strangers in the dark, but from those we fail to see, right in front of us. And yet, as haunting as that reality is, it isn't the only legacy this story leaves behind. Because beyond the bloodstains and the courtrooms, there was love. There was Gerald Whitmore, a war veteran, a civil rights attorney, a father of 6 who believed in standing up for those who had no voice. A man who played guitar with passion, who quoted poetry from memory, who once wrote to his granddaughter, "Justice isn't a law. It's a way of living." There was Evelyn Whitmore, a mother, a mentor, a woman who once told a church congregation that kindness is the only form of immortality. She acted in local plays, counseled strangers, and made everyone who entered her home feel seen. Their legacy is not how they died. It's how they lived. It's in the dozens of letters still posted on the walls of the Unitarian Church. It's in the community garden Evelyn helped start. It's in the song Gerald wrote for his granddaughter's wedding that plays every year on her anniversary. Their story didn't end in that bedroom. It continues every time someone chooses compassion over violence. Every time a parent takes a mental health warning seriously. Every time a teacher listens more closely to the quiet kid in the back row. Because if this case has taught us anything, it's this. Silence enables monsters. But attention vigilance can stop them. Victoria Whitmore once said during a public forum, "We don't want pity. We want purpose. We want people to look at this case and ask, what would I have done? Not just as a parent, but as a neighbor, as a counselor, as a citizen." That question matters, because somewhere in another town, there may be another Nathaniel, writing stories drenched in violence, drawing bloodstained notebooks, making threats that no one takes seriously, until it's too late. We can't afford to miss the signs again. This story may have started with tragedy, but it ends with a call. A call to parents: talk to your kids. Know what they're watching. Know what they're feeling. Take every warning seriously. A call to schools: don't dismiss red flags as phases. Build systems that listen and act before violence becomes reality. A call to lawmakers: reform matters. But so does balance. In our pursuit of second chances, we cannot abandon the first responsibility of the justice system, to protect the innocent. And finally, a call to all of us, to remember the names that deserve to be remembered. Gerald and Evelyn Whitmore. Not the killer, not the courtroom, but the lives that were lost. Their family continues to speak out, to testify, to show up in rooms they never asked to enter, because they know something most of us forget. That justice isn't a one-time event. It's a lifelong commitment. So before you click away from this story, before you move on to the next case, the next horror, the next headline, ask yourself, who will you remember? Because stories like this aren't just content. They're caution. They're history. They're real. If this story moved you, if you felt angry, heartbroken, or stunned, don't just scroll away. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful, deeply researched true crime cases that don't just tell the story, they seek meaning in the aftermath. Like, comment, and share to keep the conversation alive. You never know who might need to hear this story. Speech Balloon, let us know in the comments. What would you have done if you were a teacher, a counselor, a friend of Nathaniel? And most importantly, Candle, keep the memory of Gerald and Evelyn alive. Say their names. Remember their lives. Honor their love. Because in a world full of darkness, sometimes the only way forward is to tell the truth out loud. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay compassionate, and stay human.